Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with another F-4E weapons employment video. This time we're talking about high drag bombs. Now, as in my other videos kind of in this series, I'm going to run through the process quickly and directly, and then I'm going to back up and go over why things seem to work the way they do, at least for me. I do need to issue a warning though, right now. What you are about to see does not correspond to anything you will find in any official documentation, either of the real aircraft or of Heat Blur DCS, the module. If you feel that your spiritual well-being may be compromised by exposing yourself to such apostasy, I encourage you to look away now. Likewise, if the presence of heresy in the Church of DCS offends you, then feel free to stop watching now before you become motivated to find a pile of wood and a torch. In all seriousness, I'm going to demonstrate a method for using the F-4E to get high drag bombs on target consistently. This turned out not to be an easy thing to do, at least for me. The difficulty had very little to do with trying to establish the numbers, and everything to do with trying to actually hit the numbers that work while being in the near vicinity of the intended target. Now, I will also point out that while this is not an official method listed everywhere, I think it's an entirely logical one, and one that real pilots might have been tempted to use. But that's really not an argument that I can get into, because I just don't know. So let me just show you what I'm doing, and then I'll explain why, and then you can decide for yourself whether it's a method you ever want to try yourself. So first of all, let's just set up the jet. Okay, so I've wound the clock back to the beginning of the mission just to show you what the settings are. We're going to put the mode in direct. We're going to put the type of ordnance in bombs. Now we're carrying lots of Snakeyes, but I just want to drop two off the center pylon to begin with, just to test our accuracy. So I'm going to set that to 2, and I'm basically going to leave the interval to as low as it'll go. And I will wind the clock forward here to just getting ready to start our run. And you notice that I have the center pylon selected and master arm is on. Now, let's take a look at what the bombing computer suggests for a direct mode of delivery with Mk82 Snakeyes, 500 knots, 600 feet, and the target is 50 feet above sea level. I'm going to try to dive at 10 degrees. The bombing computer says that I should use a sight depression of 107 mils. I've tried this depression, and I've never been able to successfully use that depression. I'm going to use 175 mils because I did a lot of testing, and that was a number that worked. And if you want to know what I mean by testing, I do have a video that came out before the F4 was released about how you can build your own bombing table. I'm not going to go into it here. Anyways, 175 mils is the sight depression that worked for me, but that's not what I'm going to put on the reticle. And so now I need to explain just a little bit about the geometry of the reticle so you can understand what you're looking at. It's important for what I'm going to do to realize that the reticle is a circle with a radius of 50 mils. It's also important to know that a degree is around 18 mils. Actually, it's 17.8 mils in a degree. So when the sight is depressed to 125 mils, the bottom of the sight is at around 175 mils, which is about 10 degrees below the zero line of the sight, or where the pipper would be when the sight is not depressed at all. Okay, remember that. Bottom of the sight, 175 mils or 10 degrees. Okay, so here's the procedure that we're going to use. What we are trying to do is arrive over the target in a 10-degree dive at 500 knots at the right altitude. Now, I'm going to assume, by the way, that we are in what I would call a Vietnam close air support environment, meaning that we don't need to place a premium on stealth, but we do need to place a premium on staying out of the way of enemy small arms fire close to the ground, which means that we're going to have to figure out how to drop high drag bombs starting from a shallow dive rather than starting from a level pass, which is why we have put a dive angle of 10 degrees in. Okay, so let's see how this can work. So the first thing we have to do is get aimed at the target. So we're going to roll in just like we normally would, lift vector to target, roll out, but then we're going to level out. Now notice that my sight is in cage right now. It's not in air to ground yet. It's in cage. I want it up higher on the screen to help me roll out when I'm aiming at the target. I'm going to level out, and for that I'm going to look at my ADI. Now I've switched to air to ground, and now I'm looking at the bottom of the sight. Remember, the bottom of the sight is 10 degrees. When it is just beyond the target, that's going to be my signal to dive, because then I'll be diving at an angle of 10 degrees as I go over the target, which is when I need to pickle. So I just wait. As the target goes under the bottom of the reticle, somewhere around there, I dive. Now, to know where I'm aiming, I use a line drawn between the supports of the HUD, because that's about the zero flight line, right around here. So you see I put that just beyond the target. I try to hold it there. I'm holding it there. I'm holding it there, and I'm waiting for the target to go under the sight. I'm going to wait till the bottom of the reticle crosses the target and pickle there. Okay, that's the procedure. Let's see how we did. And those are pretty good bombs for a high drag bombing run. So it works. It won't find it in any book anywhere, but I think it actually makes sense for doing what we're trying to do, which is to deliver high drag bombs reasonably accurately from a shallow dive. Now, in case you want to know how accurate our dive was, let's just fast forward and take a look at the target impact tracking script. I'm not so much worried about the accuracy of the bombs, which is pretty good, but rather the parameters of the drop. Okay, there you see them. We didn't do too badly. We're almost on for height. Maybe a couple of degrees shallow in the dive and a little bit slow, and those two things probably offset. But accuracy wasn't bad. So overall, we did a pretty good job of hitting the numbers we were looking for, which was really the challenge, I think. So let's go back to the beginning of the mission and talk a little bit about how I got here. Okay, so here we are back on the runway at the start of the mission. So let's talk a little bit about high drag bombing in general and how it evolved and how it got to be where it is. High drag bombs, were deployed first in the Second World War basically as parachute bombs, but they became really much more prevalent, I would say, probably in the time of Vietnam. The idea of the high drag bombs was that it would allow pilots to be much closer to the ground when they dropped the bombs so that they could be more accurate, because pilots were finding that dropping low drag bombs from high altitude, 4,000 or 5,000 feet, from a very fast moving jet, much faster than jets had been in the Second World War or Korea, it was becoming very difficult to deliver those bombs accurately, say within 25 to 50 feet of the target. And it was also very difficult to see the targets when those targets were enemy bunkers or trenches in tree lines. So high drag bombs had the advantage that the pilot could get closer to the target. The high drag was needed because if those bombs were dropped at that altitude normally, they would hit the ground too close to the jet. In other words, the jet wouldn't have had a chance to get far enough away, and so the pilot would end up fragging himself. So that's why we have high drag bombs. The challenge in delivering high drag bombs, at least for me, is that while you are closer to the ground and closer to the target, because you are also in a very shallow dive, it's actually a lot harder to see. It's not harder to see the target, but it's harder to establish where you are when you want to drop the bombs, because the target is viewed at a very shallow angle, and frankly, it passes under your jet very quickly, and the release point is close to being under your nose. All of this makes it pretty hard to get an accurate pickle point. Now, to some extent, the whole other theory of high drag bombs doesn't matter that much, because you usually end up dropping quite a few of them in a line. So if you're not exactly accurate in your pickle, well, maybe that's not the end of the world. But I still wanted to find a way to actually figure out how to do this accurately. So the first problem is the visibility of the target. You have to find a way of actually knowing where the target is. You can do that by starting at altitude like we're going to in this method. If you do this in a low altitude ingress, you're going to have a different problem, which is you have to somehow get pointed at the target. I think I'll do another video on that later about ways that you can use laydown mode to do high drag low altitude ingress techniques, but you are going to have some way of knowing where the target is. That's not so much of an issue today. We are going to know approximately where the target is, but we're going to start from a fair ways back. So if the target is small and hard to identify, we may need some help marking the target. So that's the first problem, is know what we're aiming at. The second problem is that if you depress the sight a long ways off the bottom of the screen, it becomes very difficult to actually align with your target. the farther down the screen, the HUD screen, the pipper is, the harder it is to get yourself to the point where the pipper is actually traveling up the screen towards the target, because it swings right and left as you roll the jet. So putting the pipper, if you try to put the pipper at 200 mils, it's very difficult to know if you're actually lined up on the target. Well, that's really the reason why I'm using the bottom of the sight as my pipper, so I can actually have the sight just a little bit farther up the screen, and it's also why I use the sight in cage mode when I am actually aiming at the target, because again, I want the pipper closer to the zero sight line of the airplane in order to improve my ability to line up and stay lined up. The last problem that we have in high drag bombing, and by the way, this is not the first time that I've looked at high drag bombing. If you want to see a lot more theory about the theory of high drag bombing and all of the issues that go into it, there are a series of videos on my site that are called Rolling Snakeyes, and you can actually take a look at the theory behind high drag bombing. I'm kind of assuming you know some of that here. But the big issue with high drag bombing is that it is very sensitive to dive angle, unlike a dive bombing run. If you're trying to dive at 40 degrees and you're off by a couple of degrees, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference in your accuracy. If you're trying to dive at 10 degrees, or worse yet, if you're trying to fly level and you're off by even a couple of degrees, it's actually going to have a dramatic effect on your accuracy. So achieving the right dive angle somehow, and also arriving over the target at the right altitude, are two things that we have to figure out ways. We have to figure out a way of combining those two things, and that's ultimately what this method of dropping the bombs for me was about. So let's go walk through the approach again a little bit more carefully, and I'll explain to you why I'm doing the things I'm doing and why they help with the particular challenges of high drag bombing. Okay, we're taking a swing out here a little past the edge of the coastline. I'm going to go down a little ways, longer than I usually do for a range run. I will point out, by the way, that this is the reason why, things like this are the reason why I created the range. It not only gives you results about your accuracy, which honestly, let's face it, is less of an issue with high drag bombs, since they do tend to disperse quite widely when you drop a lot of them. It's not really so much about the accuracy. It's really more about getting those other parameters, trying to see how the accuracy on the ground relates to dive angle, speed, and altitude at release, and trying to figure out how to manage all of those three things. Okay, we're rolling in. The idea here is to point the local vertical line, the inner line, at the target, and then roll so that the true vertical line is aligned with it. That means your wings are level. Now, I'm pulling level, and I'm using the ADI to measure that, which means I have to keep flicking my eyes downward, which does make staying aligned on the target a bit of a challenge. So remember, we're going to watch the reticle, and as the target goes under the reticle there, we're going to start to dive. We're going to use that line across the top of the HUD, put that just beyond the target, and that should hopefully get us over the target at around the right height, watching the height, watching the speed, and watching the ADI, as well as trying to stay aligned on the target. Not an easy combination. And there's the pickle as the bottom of the reticle goes over the target. Well, those are pretty good results, honestly. About as good as can be expected, I find, with high drag bombs, if you're only dropping 2 of them, which we were. So let's up the ante a little bit here and go to dropping more of the bombs. There you can see the target impact tracking script. And so we were about on height and speed, a little low, a little slow, and a little shallow in the dive, which is probably why the bombs were a little long, but not too bad. So the parameters weren't exactly right, but obviously there's some self-correction going on inside there, so it wasn't a bad drop at all. More importantly, that's kind of the procedure we want to use. That sight picture that we had both when we started the dive and when we pickled. That's what we want to try and replicate in future attacks. It's not about trying to read the numbers from down in the cockpit. It's really about trying to get the right sight picture. Okay, I'm using the target impact tracking strip to ask for a smoke mark. It's giving me a smoke mark on a target that's actually 4 M113s. You can see it in the distance there. I'm using the smoke mark because I think that's not unreasonable in this kind of attack. When you're approaching the target from this low, from this acute an approach angle, it's really difficult to spot in the distance. And I think that this kind of attack would mostly be used, at least in Vietnam, when you had troops in contact that would be marking the target, or when you had a FAC that was marking the target. So I don't think it's unreasonable to use a smoke mark. Now, the smoke mark's not exactly on the target, so we're going to have to adjust as we get closer, but hopefully by then we'll be able to see it. So again, the same procedure. We're rolling in. I'm trying to keep that local vertical, the inside arrow, pointed at the target, and roll out until both arrows are aligned. That's not bad. Okay, time to go to air to ground, and time to get level. Now watch. Keep it level, keep it level. Wait until it goes just beyond. Now go down. Again, dive. Feels like we're getting very close to the ground, but I need to keep the top of the HUD supports just beyond the target. Not on the target, or I'll fly into it. And then I need to wait until the pipper goes over the target there. It's a nice string of bombs. And they go right across the target. So again, that looks like a pretty good drop to me. We actually did some damage. Now, it's a little bit overkill for a target that small, so maybe why don't we do this one more time. And let's take some of that line of buildings down there in the building compound, and let's see if we can really string the bombs out along that. Okay, you know, this is a good point, I think, maybe for me to go back and just say something about the comments I made at the beginning of the video, which were made in jest and were not intended to offend anybody, and I am genuinely sorry if they did. They're basically an acknowledgement, at least to my perspective, that sometimes there's a lot of discussion in DCS about how things are supposed to work. Sometimes developers are criticized because some table that was published in 1965 doesn't seem to apply to the way the player wants to interpret that table and fly the jet. And I just don't think that's a very helpful way of looking at DCS. To me, the accuracy of your technique should be judged by the results on the ground. That's why I built the range, so that I could assess those things quantitatively and compare them to the drop parameters quantitatively. So this is a system that works for me. It's entirely invented by me, but it's not. It is based on some understanding of the way these things work, and I've worked with enough fighter pilots to know how they invent ways of doing things. So I do believe that it's not unreasonable. If you have a better way of doing it, I'd love to hear about it. But honestly, I'll believe it's better when you do this, when you go out to the range and you get consistent results several times in a row, getting as accurate as you want to be, and hitting the numbers you want to hit. So if you'd like to show me a better way to do this, please do. But please prove it by going out to the range and getting some results. Okay, so we're rolled in, we're diving at that target. This is the hardest part to me, is keeping the dive. I tend to want to shallow out, which I think I'm doing a little bit here. Got to keep it in the dive, keep it on speed. I've let it slow down a little. And there go the bombs. That covered the target pretty well. So again, I think I'm pretty happy with this method of dropping high drag bombs, even if it is non-standard. As I said, your mileage may certainly vary, and if you have better ways of doing this, I really would like to hear about them. Not just what the numbers should be, but how to actually fly those numbers and how to do it consistently so that you can actually develop a method for doing this when you need to do it, even when you're not on the range. That's why I fly on the range, so I can develop the muscle memory to do this effectively. If you've got a better way of doing it, I'd love to hear about it. For now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.